Hello.
Yes, I think you are audible.
Okay, fine. Yeah, just checking.
Yes.
Good evening and good afternoon to one and all present here. Very glad to welcome everyone to this the third and final webinar of the ASPIC webinar series. So we had initially started this the ASPIC webinar series in June, and we had about a couple of webinars in the past 2 months, and this is the third and final section of that. So in the past 2 webinars, we are mainly dealing with the environmental implications of AMR, and also we looked into different food system challenges in concern to AMR. And for today's webinar, we are mainly looking at the aspects of sustainable development, poverty reduction in relation to AMR. So I think until now, with the series, we had been mainly focusing on the environmental and animal health aspects of AMR, and today we'll be looking into the development aspects as such. So as we know, AMR is seen as one of the top or top 10 global health, public health threats facing the countries now. And this again calls for a multi-sectorial action in order to contain different aspects of antimicrobial resistance. And today we have 2 fabulous speakers with us, Dr. Jessica Michel and also Dr. Tracy Muriel, who are with us today to handle the sessions. So mainly today's sessions are mainly divided into 2. The first session will be on sustainable development goals and its relation to antimicrobial resistance. And the second session will be on WASH implications of AMR. Again, it will be related to the overall aspect of the theme of the webinar today. So I think we have more people coming in now. So without further delay, I would like to introduce the first speaker of the day, Dr. Jessica. Dr. Jessica is a postdoctoral research fellow managing the community engagement for AMR network. Dr. Jessica joined the University of Leeds in 2019 with a research background in zoology. Through her PhD, she has been investigating scent communication and parasitism in band mongooses, by which she got to spend time in the Queen Elizabeth National Park, Uganda. Here she developed a passion for teaching and community engagement, mainly around conservation and human-wildlife conflict. After her PhD, Dr. Jess lectured at the university level and worked in high school environmental education with the social enterprise solutions for the planet. Dr. Jessica has designed, delivered, and evaluated a range of climate and environment-focused education programs and has become particularly interested in the use of participatory research to tackle global challenges. Dr. Jess is currently a research fellow on the COSTA project and is also PI of the AMR in Schools project within the CE for AMR network. She also manages the community engagement for AMR network, and her personal research interests lie in the environmental consequences of antimicrobial misuse and how community engagement projects can create positive behavior change on this issue. She is also particularly interested in the role of wildlife within the One Health dynamics of AMR, and is also interested in the development of evaluation strategies to evidence the impact of behavior change interventions. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Jessica to address the audience.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Vishal, and thank you very much for having me with you this evening, afternoon, morning, depending where you are. I'm just going to share my screen now. While I'm talking, sometimes when I get carried away, I can talk quite fast. So if at any point I'm talking too fast, please do interrupt me and tell me to slow down, and I will. Okay, so I'm just going to switch my camera off, I think, while I present. I'll just hide that actually. Okay, so as Vishal really nicely introduced there, I'm based at the University of Leeds, where I'm a research fellow at the moment. My name is Dr. Jessica Mitchell. So I've got quite a weird background in zoology and environmental education, but all of this is kind of tied together by the use of community-based and participatory methods. And at the moment I work and coordinate a network called CE for AMR, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. And today I'm going to talk about AMR in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals with a real focus on community-based projects, creating equitable partnerships, and particularly working in low resource settings. So I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to the network, but then I will look at particularly how AMR and the SDGs intersect based on a piece of work we've recently done on AMR policy and guidance documents. I'm going to consider how AMR and the Sustainable Development Goals interact, and why AMR currently appears to be missing from the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, I'll discuss a little bit about the challenges and opportunities in trying to better align AMR with the goals. But I thought really quickly I'd just recap first on what we mean by AMR, or antimicrobial resistance. So I'm sure you all know, but it's the process by which microbes change or evolve to resist the effects of the drugs we use to treat them. So the graphic here particularly shows bacteria responding to antibiotic drugs. But AMR is a natural process by which any microbe can change to avoid stressors. So it could be stressors such as temperature or pollution, it could be stressors such as overcrowding of microbes, but we're particularly interested in the stressor in terms of the use or misuse of antimicrobial drugs. And this is because if a drug is used in the wrong way or for the wrong length of time, it might not completely destroy the microbe that's causing the infection or disease it's being used to treat. What the drug does instead is just stress that microbe, leading them to change their DNA, change the way they're made up, change their behavior, which allows resistance to develop. So the same thing can occur if we use the wrong drug to treat the wrong bug, because antimicrobial drugs are very specific. And resistant infections, once they're created, become much harder to treat. They can require lots of different treatments, more expensive treatments, longer periods of treatments. And unfortunately, this can lead to really prolonged periods of illness and even death. Now, we know from previous webinars that you guys have had that AMR occurs not only in humans, but also in animals and plants and the environment. And we really need to remember this and remember this One Health focus of AMR, because it is a huge problem. Over 2/3 of the world's antimicrobials are used in domesticated animals, not just human health. It's not a new problem. So AMR, we think, causes about 700,000 human deaths a year. And this is predicted to rise to over 10 million annually by 2050 if we don't do anything. And unsurprisingly, our lower resource settings bear the brunt of this challenge in terms of the numbers of resistant infections and the numbers of deaths, and also the increased spending on healthcare and safeguarding the health of food producing animals from AMR. So it's a really big and expensive problem. And for me, it's quite surprising because of all these reasons that AMR isn't recognised in our Sustainable Development Goals. So these goals, as many of you will know, were developed by the United Nations off the back of the Millennium Development Goals. And they focus on creating equitable and poverty-free global communities. They came into action in 2015 with the target of being achieved by 2030. And I think we can probably all agree that that seems quite an ambitious target. Now, it's interesting that the SDGs don't specifically mention AMR. They didn't mention it when they were developed several years ago. And although in 2019, the WHO did add a specific AMR indicator into one of the goals, so the goals around good health and well-being, this indicator is about monitoring drug-resistant infections, and many countries simply don't have the capacity to do this. So in a real sense, AMR is still almost completely missing from the goals. And this is challenging because AMR impacts on and is impacted by so many of the goals. So a recent report from the SDG Knowledge Hub itself recognised that modern medicine depends on ensuring life-saving drugs work. And AMR obviously erodes the ability of these drugs to work. And this could hamper goals such as number 3 on health and well-being, but also goals 1 and 2 relating to poverty and hunger, and goal 8 of decent economic growth. So this is something that I'm personally very interested in, but the network at the University of Leeds, our CE for AMR network, is also really interested in. So CE for AMR stands for Community Engagement for AMR. And as you can imagine, we're really interested in the use of community-based methods to ask questions and co-develop solutions to a range of AMR challenges. And we work exclusively within low resource settings. So we've been going for about 2 years now, and the network was set up during an international meeting in Kathmandu, Nepal in 2019. And a specific pot of funding for this meeting was sought, and we brought together professionals in the areas of AMR and CE to discuss, how could these community-based approaches be better utilised to address the complex challenge of AMR. The network includes such a diverse range of members. We have clinicians and public health specialists, but also vets and zoologists, sociologists, anthropologists, environmentalists. And we really focus on providing our stakeholders with the resources to join up community engagement and AMR projects. We also create networking opportunities, which have mostly been online at the moment, obviously. And we mainly do this through our website, which includes a resource hub, a blog, and a newsletter. And I've popped the details on there, and they're at the end of the presentation as well. So we work with about 11 different projects based mainly in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa at the moment. And we tend to look at the demand side of AMR, so the use and misuse of drugs. Most of our projects are focused on the human aspects of AMR and One Health, but we are moving towards considering more animal, environmental, wash-based challenges. We have active collaborations with a number of other AMR-focused organisations, but we're also really interested in the policy implications of our work. How can we fit community engagement into existing research agendas on AMR and beyond? How does community engagement activities align with the global guidance on AMR and the Sustainable Development Goals? And we use the goals to guide a lot of our planning and funding applications, but this is quite difficult when the Sustainable Development Goals themselves don't actually place much emphasis on AMR. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this discussion today is reflect on a piece of work that we've recently completed, which aimed to analyse global AMR guidance to look at what the key themes of AMR action were across all different policy documents, so that we could create a really simple framework which would support AMR projects to work efficiently and effective toward global AMR goals. Now, during this analysis, we noticed just how closely a lot of the AMR wording was to the Sustainable Development Goals. And then in turn, how much of a big AMR-shaped hole seemed to be sitting within the SDGs. And we felt this is a really important message to share. So I'm really pleased to be able to speak about it today. But there is also a blog on our website which details some of the discussion points I'll be presenting. So to create this framework of AMR common themes across the guidance, we looked at about 24 documents. Some of them were international documents prepared by funders like the Wellcome Trust, big organisations such as the WHO, but a lot of them were country-specific national action plans on AMR. And we picked a number from each continent so we could get a really good range. And what we did was pull out the 8, as it happened, most common themes that kept coming up in these documents, as you can see on this schematic. Now, for our original purposes, this was really exciting because we felt that community engagement could be applied to enhance all of these themes and so really encourage our own research agenda. But we also noticed that the themes and the wording that came up in the themes related to a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look firstly at theme number 1, so optimising the use of antimicrobials in humans and animals. The AMR guidance tends to talk about ensuring equitable and affordable access to drugs. And this really chimes with Sustainable Development Goal 1 around zero poverty and 10 around reduced inequalities. You know, if we're going to create a genuinely equitable global society, everyone is going to need access to the same high quality medications. And we do not see this at the moment in terms of antimicrobials as well as other drugs. We know that many communities don't have a choice of drugs. And the repercussions of this is that they could end up using the same drug to treat the wrong infection and thus fueling and driving AMR. Similarly, AMR guidance discusses points around appropriate use of antimicrobials. So taking the right drug for the right bug, but also for the right amount of time and not sharing your medication. And this really fits with SDG 3 on good health and well-being. There's also less obvious connections. So if we look at points around reducing antimicrobials in food production sectors, these actually link to Sustainable Development Goal 2 on zero hunger, but also animal health, which is considered in SDG 15, which is life on land. And this is because inappropriate use of antimicrobials in food producing animals can cause AMR to develop, create opportunities for resistant infections to cause severe disease, and harm our food production sectors. So there's real tangible links here between AMR and the SDGs. But there's also less obvious and slightly more hidden links. So if we look at the third theme for AMR action that we identified from the guidance, is talking about increasing public engagement with AMR. Now, this might not seem to link to the SDGs at all, but if we think about some of these points in context, we do see some interlinkages. So the AMR guidance discusses the need to educate people on AMR so that they can use drugs most effectively. However, we know that access to good education is not universal. There are huge gender inequalities and other inequalities in our education systems, particularly in low resource settings. So without achieving goals such as SDG 4 on quality education and SDG 5 on gender inequality and 10 on reducing inequalities in general, we might not be able to provide appropriate AMR education. So there's really strong links there with, in order to achieve these aims of global AMR documents, we really need to be working towards the SDGs as well. And we'll see more interlinkages if we look at, say, theme 5 around infection prevention. So AMR guidance talks a lot about the need for clean water and safe sanitation, which really mirrors the aim of SDG 6 which is around water security, but I'm sure Dr. Tracy's going to talk a bit more about this sector. There's also a lot of discussion around safe animal husbandry and minimising infection and having good farming practices, which really links to SDG 15 of life on land in terms of creating healthy habitats for our farmed animals. But these points could also relate to SDG 14, which is life below water, if these animals are fish or shellfish. Now, we know that fish is a really important source of protein for a lot of low resource communities. And we also know a large amount of antimicrobials are used to support fish and shellfish farming, particularly shrimp farming. There's a really high risk of infections moving when antimicrobials are used in water-based farming environments. So another hidden link there to the SDGs. Our AMR themes can also relate to our climate action goal, SDG 13. And this is because the process of AMR, of microbes becoming stressed, changing and developing resistance, can be exacerbated by things such as warming temperatures and UV radiation. So failing to address the climate crisis could have major repercussions on AMR as well. So overall, as we look through the details of our AMR themes, we were starting to see where AMR action could perhaps support the achievement of certain sustainable development goals. But also we could see where areas where the sustainable development goals aren't being achieved so well could really stop us making progress on AMR. And on this image, you can see the goals that we felt most frequently aligned with AMR action. So they're often those around health, poverty, inequalities, but also animals and the environment. So really representing this one health dynamic of antimicrobial resistance. But considering all this evidence and discussion points, why is AMR so conspicuously absent from the SDGs? It's almost $1 million question. But there are a few things to remember if we think about when the SDGs were created and how they were created. So they came off the back of the Millennium Development Goals. So in a way, they're quite old, and the language and the wording and the terms are quite old. The timing of their development was before we started to use the phrase, One Health, to refer to these complex and interlinked challenges such as AMR that join up human, animal and environmental health problems. Secondly, the SDGs tend to focus on really immediate, tangible, meaningful threats such as hunger and poverty, economic damage. They do include some more complex challenges like climate change, but mainly they reflect the need to respond to immediate threats, and AMR often isn't seen as that immediate threat. And linked to this point, my third suggestion for why AMR could be missing from the SDGs is that AMR is often a hidden problem. It's known as the silent pandemic and might be covered up or masked by other points. So I'm going to have a look at these 3 points in a bit more detail now, and to potentially help us understand why AMR might be missing from the SDGs. So this lack of One Health focus, I think, is a really important point, and it has been raised in the literature quite a bit in recent years. So this publication presents a really interesting argument based on the fact that the SDGs were developed by multiple different partners, often with a lot of knowledge in one specific area, but they often didn't talk too much between each other. They may have had focus groups with their stakeholders to develop their specific SDG, but then they didn't join up with other groups. So this can mean that the SDGs are often presented or thought of as very separate aims without discussion of their interactions or how the goals can positively or negatively impact each other. And in this publication, the authors actually create this really nice graphic that shows the SDGs within a One Health framework, which I think is really helpful to join up the dots between them. And AMR as a problem obviously really stresses this point because it is such a One Health challenge which can't be tackled in isolation. So secondly, if we think of SDGs as being responsive to immediate threats, they focus on problems often relating to everyday life, like putting food on the table, keeping your income healthy, maintaining your own physical health. AMR is often seen as almost a future problem that we don't connect to our lives right now. So for example, if you're hungry, if you need more food now, it might actually be sensible for you to use antimicrobials in your animal feed to get a larger animal that's going to feed you for longer, or feed more people, or generate more income. However, we know that AMR can develop from this type of antimicrobial use, and it could completely cripple your whole business model in several years if a resistant infection takes hold of your livestock. So we need to ensure that this kind of messaging is translated into AMR, and that it's recognised as a problem for everyone in their own lives that does impact on a lot of these more familiar sustainable development goals. And again, we can see other graphics that have been developed to this end to try and communicate this immediate need for AMR action, and the fact that AMR really is everyone's problem. And finally, if we think of AMR as being this silent pandemic, you know, it's often hidden in a way by other challenges. So at the moment, all our health work, you know, the work of SDG 3 on good health and well-being is almost being taken over by COVID. And it's the same with AMR. We're seeing people dying very quickly. We're seeing health systems crumbling and being overwhelmed under pressure to act. And antimicrobials are being used often without a diagnostic test, just in an attempt to do something to alleviate the situation. But despite the fact we know that antimicrobials aren't going to work on the initial COVID virus, although they may treat secondary bacterial infections. But this continues because we don't see the death toll from AMR, we're only seeing the COVID-related deaths. And antimicrobials are used in a similar way, as sort of a status quo in farming practices. So their risk is often masked by the, you know, the social norms, the expectation that you would use an antimicrobial within your flock just to encourage good growth, or just in case, just to make sure that they don't get a disease, which is actually the wrong thing to do. So we really need to unpick the inequalities within this silent pandemic as well. So some people have a lot of access to antimicrobials. They can make sure that they're using the right drug to treat the right bug and use it as sparingly as possible. Other communities don't have that choice. One, they might not be able to afford the right type of antimicrobial for their illness. Other times the antimicrobials just won't be available there. So this means the wrong drug could be used for an ailment, it could be used for long periods of time, and this excess access debate is really a huge problem in understanding AMR. And even when AMR is recognised for the challenge it is, it may be that countries just don't have the capacity, the financial means, to conduct regular and detailed AMR surveillance, which means the problem grows and develops unchecked. So we can't quite respond to AMR because we don't have the real-time data on it. So that's all slightly depressing. But what can we actually do about this? And I've noticed here, you know, while I was creating this talk, there's loads and loads of pictures and infographics that have been created that link the AMR and the SDGs together. But practically, there doesn't seem to be that much work on the ground. You know, I've mentioned that an AMR indicator was built into the SDGs in 2019, but I've also mentioned there's a few problems with this. But overall, you know, attempting to change legislation can be quite tricky. So maybe it's better that we just lead by example in terms of the research that we're doing. Now, luckily, we are seeing a lot of what we call cross-cutting research funding to make this more achievable. So in a lot of AMR funding calls, the funder talks about the One Health dynamics of the problem. They encourage interdisciplinarity, they encourage international collaborations, they encourage support for low resource settings to make the project more sustainable. So this could by virtue really drive diverse action on AMR and pick up the sustainable development goals as we go. There's also a lot of grassroots engagement with both AMR and the SDGs at community level that can help uncover some of the linkages between the two and also sort of translate the messages between AMR and the SDGs. AMR itself has been addressed by a global coalition of organisations, including the WHO, joining with animal and agricultural health bodies. So there's really this strong focus now, not just to address parts of the problem, but the whole problem. And it's that framework we maybe need to move into the SDGs. So in summary, I think we perhaps, rather than think about squeezing AMR into the SDGs and changing their wording, we perhaps need to think of AMR as an example of active One Health research, which could actually support us to develop research and projects that really tackle the Sustainable Development Goals. And some of my projects at CE for AMR have started to really think about this in more detail. So this is a project that's just completed. It was a global project that focused on understanding the best ways of using community engagement to tackle AMR. Now, we worked across mainly Southeast Asia, as you can see, but also a couple of African countries with really different groups of people. So we were working with poultry farmers, with housewives, with women's discussion groups, with farmers and pastoralist communities. And we wanted to speak to all these different project teams to understand how they've reached these different audiences on the topic of AMR and how they've contextualized their work to have impact. And it really came out that the flexibility of community-based work and working with your community to ask questions is a really good way of tackling a complex challenge like AMR. It's impossible to tackle through a one-size-fits-all approach. So as you can see, this kind of approach to AMR could really work for tackling the SDGs and making sure that we do actually hit these targets of zero hunger, no poverty, good health and well-being, educational equality by 2030. I should have clicked onto that sooner, sorry. So in summary, what I hope I've done today is given you a really brief introduction to some of the work we do at CE for AMR, particularly how AMR themes, objectives and targets closely overlap with a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals. I've discussed this AMR-shaped hole in the SDGs and why ignoring the threat of AMR could really hamper progress toward achieving many of these goals. And we've also reflected on some of the reasons why AMR might not be included within the SDGs. But I think what's important is to consider this as an opportunity rather than a challenge. AMR research really does seem to lead by example in terms of joining up complex One Health challenges. And so I'd like to think that my take-home message from this is really that rather than worrying about why AMR isn't written into the SDGs, let's use AMR research as a roadmap for achieving the SDGs in a much more contextual and joined up fashion so that we can create holistic and sustainable solutions for the future. So I'm going to leave it for there now. I'm very happy to take any questions, but I do just want to say really thank you for listening and thank you for having me today on behalf of myself and the rest of the CE for AMR team who couldn't be here to join the presentation today. I will share a few details in the chat as well if you'd like to have a look at our website or perhaps sign up for our newsletter. But again, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Jessica, for the presentation. The floor is now open for any questions you have. You can either write your questions in the chat box or you can ask them directly.
Hello. Thank you, Jessica. It was a nice talk, and the link between the SDG goals and SDG goals and also the AMR was built very nicely. So one doubt I had was won't the national action plans, which are made for the purpose of working on AMR, won't it consider the sustainable development goals that are already been given by WHO? How it works, like while they are preparing the national action plans on AMR?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. So the WHO guidance does reference the Sustainable Development Goals, and it encourages countries and the committee developing the plan to look at them. But the wording can be quite different between different countries. So there's a lot of flexibility in how that's interpreted. So I think the WASH, so water, sanitation and hygiene sector, is one that there is quite a lot of similarity between what the AMR action plans are saying and what the Sustainable Development Goals are saying. But in other areas, particularly this idea of AMR education, there's almost no reflection on the fact that education is not an equal right in a lot of places. So that's an example of maybe where the Sustainable Development Goals aren't guiding AMR action when perhaps maybe they should be.
Thank you.
We also have one question in the chat. It's basically asking to explain the implementation of One Health policy. It is a question from Dr. Sudha.
So in terms of the implementation of One Health policy, I guess this is one of the big challenges of AMR. A lot of the time, AMR action is happening in separate ministries. So the Ministry of Health may have an AMR agenda, the Ministry of Agriculture may have one, the Ministry of Environment, but they're not quite talking to each other at the moment. And what we see a lot in low resource settings is that the main financial spend on AMR is within human health. So the Ministry of Health may be funding a surveillance system to look for resistant infections in a hospital setting, but there's actually no money to fund the same system in the environment, in the water sector, in the agricultural health sector. So although there may be discussions that seem One Health, in terms of each sector's talking about AMR, it's not yet joined up, that loop isn't joined up. And a number of the projects within the CE for AMR network are really trying to make that link, trying to make sure that departments are talking to each other in language that everybody understands, and that there's a commitment to try and discuss maybe how they could improve surveillance in areas other than just human health. And because that's definitely what we're seeing at the moment, is the strongest surveillance and the largest amount of funding is on AMR in the human health side of One Health. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Jessica, for the answering to the queries. So if there are no further questions, sorry, I was on mute. So thank you, Dr. Jessica, for the presentation and answering to the queries. So thank you once again for the talk and the interaction.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. So now we'll be moving on to the second session of the day. And for introducing the speaker for the next session, Tracy Mariah. Tracy Mariah works for REACT Africa as a policy officer. Her role mainly revolves around engaging, supporting, and advocating for implementation of member countries' national action plans on AMR. based on the evidence informed through policy analysis. Prior to joining React Africa, Tracy also worked as the program officer at EPN, majorly involved in projects planning and implementation to promote access to quality pharmaceutical services in LMICs. I would like to cordially welcome Tracy for taking the session. Tracy, are you there?
Sorry, I was on mute. Apologies. Good afternoon, good evening, maybe good morning to others. As I've been introduced, I am Dr. Tracy Muraya, and I currently practice in Kenya, but for React Africa as the policy advisor. I want you to allow me to do something quite unorthodox, and that is to thank the previous speaker, Dr. Jessica Mitchell. That was actually an excellent presentation. Yeah, I hope I shall do justice. So, Vishal, kindly share the screen for me. Thank you. All right, so without further ado, I shall just take you through presentation on the WASH implications of AMR. As Dr. Mitchell has already spoken about AMR, I know I will not have to belabor quite much on it, but really to try and tie it up with water, sanitation and hygiene aspect of it. Next slide, please. So we will go through, that's just a bit of the outline, I apologize. Just introduce WASH aspect, a bit of statistics, intersection, how it intersects with AMR. Just try and also percolate the economic burden that the two, when combined, actually bring out, and perhaps what we can propose as a sensible solution. Next slide. So as an introduction, water sanitation and hygiene was actually recognized at the high level of the UN General Assembly in 2010 as a human right, that everyone does have the right to sufficient, continuous, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water, not only for personal use, but also domestic use. And I think we can agree in most of our settings, this is yet to be achieved in many, many communities. So as the previous speaker has ably addressed, it is addressed via Sustainable Development Goal 6, apologies for the typo there, which states that the main role of the goal is to ensure that there's availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. So as has already been highlighted, the SDGs, yes, maybe were formed by different experts who are from different sectors, but they try and all work towards perhaps the same goal, which is goal 17 of actually partnership and just global development all around. So apart from good health, or it directly affecting good health, not only in humans, but animals, safe wash contributes to all the other SDGs. So whether it's from reducing child mortality under mother and child health, but also eradicating poverty, which is in SDG 1, and in that way then build resilient communities. Now, as I've mentioned, it does directly affect good health. And so for it to actually be impactful in terms of addressing WASH effectively and efficiently, good governance coupled with promoting universal and sustainable access to safe WASH is key. It's key in public health, in ensuring that we mitigate development and spread of resistant microorganisms, or what are at times referred to as superbugs. So having that just very brief and summarized introduction, I hope then it is able to poke your minds into seeing how water, sanitation, and hygiene does directly affect health, and hence, from just the previous speaker, you're able to already see how it can lead to AMR if not mitigated. So a little bit of statistics. Next slide, please. And with stats, what I will try and highlight is from a household level, a community level, and also healthcare facility levels, and also learning institutions. Why I picked these three levels really is because this is where, one, in our region, and I'm speaking for Asia Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa, that's where we will usually find those that comprise the community, and yet the basic needs are not really in place. Basic needs, one of them, of course, being wash. And then this will further look at them in terms of access to drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene. So with the first one, access to drinking water, it's unfortunate that as we speak right now, data from last year in 2020 was showing that an excess of 2 billion people was still drinking water from sources that were contaminated with feces. And of the 71% of the global population in 2017, and 2017, the global population was ranging at about 7.6 billion. 71% that were were accessing safely managed drinking water, and that is at the place they are, whether it's at home, in the offices, when they needed it, and it was free from contamination, were mainly based in the high income setting, right? Low resource settings, on the other hand, was a different ballgame altogether. In 2020, the researchers tried to, WHO specifically, tried to disaggregate this information a bit more and to specify, at home, at the home setting, how many people are actually able to access such water. And it was a measly 107 million people out of the 7.8 billion global population. Also, data from 2017 was showing us that only 785 million people were actually able to access water that is considered from a basic drinking water source, meaning it's improved and can be accessed within around about half an hour. So in our setup, for example, you will find many women or children actually going with a bucket or whichever container to go fetch the water. Is it accessible within those 30 minutes, A? And B, is it at least safe to drink, even if it's just through boiling mechanisms? And then a further 144 million people in 2017 were actually dependent on surface water. This is the same surface water that is possibly contaminated with feces, and was still also levels of toxic agents such as arsenic, which can continue then to expose us to diseases such as cancer, which, yes, might not be relevant to today's discussion in that it's non-communicable, but then we all know the ravaging effects that, for example, cancer will bring even to the immune system, which then exposes us more to antibiotic use and hence antimicrobial resistance creeping in. Data is showing that should we proceed as status quo and with the rapid urban development, and unfortunately informal urban settings, then half the world's population will be living in water-stressed areas by 2025. Not to mention the current climate change effects that we are finding across the globe, actually, where dams are being destroyed or breaking, and there's landslides, fires, and water view. Next slide, please. Still at household community level, matter sanitation. It's not foreign to find our setups, not only in the far-flung remote areas, but even just in the concentrated urban slum dwelling, where there's open defecation still going on, both in our regions in Asia Pacific and in Africa. So this is still an issue. And while in 2017, data was showing that, about 45% of the population was accessing well-managed sanitation services, and that there was still another 31% that had private sanitation facilities that were actually connected to good wastewater sources. Unfortunately, yet again, these were found in the high-income countries. When we come home to Africa and Asia, where latrine use is what we find commonly, then it's about 1 billion people, or 14% of the population in 2017, that had access to well-managed latrines. The rest, meaning a very small population, had access to safely managed sanitation within their homes or within their offices, living around about the number shown there, 673 million people openly defecating. And although the numbers were not derived, majority of them were still practicing cartage excreta, where they would go for help themselves, perhaps at a corner, maybe in a cut-out carton or something like that, collect it, and then dispose it off where they can dispose it off, whether it's in open field or maybe a closed latrine. And this, of course, just brings its own repercussions in the environment where our wastewaters are not really well treated. So this shows you how then the global population, as we know it, will possibly more than 10% of what is reflected in front of you will consume food that's irrigated using wastewater that is exposed to not only excreta, but also toxic agents, maybe from washing agents that we use at home, or sanitizing products, especially now that we have COVID. And homes are being washed with hypochlorite disinfectants and such things. And so this wastewater is finding itself to our farms, where the animals are actually consuming the same water, or plants that are growing with water that is exposed to such agents. Next slide, please. Still at household and community level, hygiene. And here, hygiene, I know right now the slide in front of you is concentrating on hand hygiene. But hygiene, we should also think and note that hygiene encompasses handling of food, handling of our surroundings and environments, and even menstrual hygiene, which is really overlooked in many of our setups. Many other times that you will go to the urban slum dwelling and you will find the women and the girls do not have access to, toilets inside their homes. They have to use toilets outside their homes. And are they able to even wash their hands after the use of such facilities? Are they able to even afford the sanitary towels to actually observe their own menstrual hygiene? So of course, at household level, and even now community level, and especially now with the COVID-19, there's been a great improvement. Well, okay, great, but still slight when you look at the absolute numbers. Because now we're seeing that in 2020 data, this data was collected in March 2020, 2.3 billion of the world's population still lacked basic hygiene facilities, such as soap and water in their homes. However, this was a slight improvement from the 2017 data that showed 3 billion people did have that problem. Interestingly, though, the data that was collected did not contain data on hygiene from the high-income countries. Maybe this was an oversight in that it might be seen there's no problem there, but is it? We will see in later slides as we tackle the One Health aspect of it. Next slide, please. So as we move to healthcare facility levels, where WASH is, unfortunately, even at the policy level and guidance level and frameworks, we tend to find that WASH is addressed more at healthcare facility level rather than the household and community level. Be that as it may, still when we come down to low and middle income countries or the really resource limited areas, we still find that 1 in 4 healthcare facilities still lack basic water services. And by basic, of course, the definition that we used before. And worse still, 1 in 5 of the same healthcare facilities lack proper sanitation services. And the situation tends to be worse in smaller healthcare facilities, which are actually twice as likely to lack both aspects altogether. And this contributes to hospital-acquired infections, which are also known as nosocomial infections, and complications in managing mother and child health, and just simple infections that may come in and just turn out into something else. So this therefore translates to about 2 billion people who visit our healthcare facilities and are exposed to unprotected water sources, and about 1.5 billion using the same healthcare facilities and lacking in toilets. Next slide, please. When it comes to our learning institutions, especially with elementary school going children, pre-COVID, UNICEF data showed that in 2017, and this was research done by both WHO and UNICEF, that less than 50% of the schools had toilets that were accessible for students, and especially with limited mobility, which also brings out the inequality and lack of equity when it comes to accessing some of these very basic sanitation services. And of course, much of this data was being derived from the low and middle income countries in terms of what was lacking. 23% of schools had no sanitation services, 36% of schools had no hygiene in terms of hand washing facilities, and 19% of schools did not have drinking water within the facilities. Of course, this has improved quite a bit in, when we look post-COVID. The question usually posed by many researchers or many people on ground is, when COVID is finally controlled, will we see a setback, or will we actually possibly be at the forefront advocating that these are structures that need to be maintained? Because as we now well know, we are bound to be experiencing pandemics every so often and more often than before. So next slide, please. As we look at the intersection with AMR, which has been really brought out quite well. What you see in front of you, apologies, this should, the photo behind you should have come before, but I think because it's in the PDF version, you might not be able to see well. That is a setup in Egypt along the River Nile, where there's women, there are 2 women who are washing dishes with soap. And then there's a group of boys that is actually fishing. And then there's another group just looking at them, maybe 1 or 2 boys just looking over at them at the activities. And then if you look further down, you will find some buildings. Now these buildings, the paper that wrote this in the Reuters says that these buildings lack basic utility services. We, however, do not know whether these are actually household buildings. Are they commercial buildings where maybe chemicals are being churned into the River Nile and toxic chemicals at that matter? So this is generally what you will find in our setup, low and middle income countries, where you'll find either displaced populations or a large number of slum dwellers relying on the same water sources for drinking, for washing, for cleaning, for recreation, yeah? And also note the gender aspect right there. It's the women who tend to be more exposed to this water. However, one might also argue that the boys are fishing and the same fish will be eaten at home by the entire family. So yes, the fish is also being exposed to the toxic chemicals. And let's just say that there's a factory, a pharmaceutical factory in one of those buildings that we see back there. Is their effluent well controlled, or antibiotic residues are actually making it to the water that is feeding the fish that will finally feed the families that we see there, right? So apart from the diarrheal diseases and perhaps even neglected tropical diseases such as schistosomiasis that you'll find there, then we also have the possibility of these children and families being exposed already to resistant bugs and resistant genes within the water. Next slide, please. So the next slide just tries to show the same scenario, but from a One Health lens. When it comes to WASH, we tend to concentrate a lot on the low and middle income countries or the low resource settings, as you have seen in the previous slide. However, even in our high income countries, they are actually riddled with extensive biocide use, where right there, if you see there's a manufacturing of antimicrobials, and we know there's a lot of factory, not necessarily for antimicrobials, but for whatever else, you will find that there's a lot of factory setup going on. And these are released into the environment through the water, exposing them just as equally. Or you'll find large farms in animal and plant production. Is this water well controlled? Or as the antibiotics being fed to the animals and the fertilizers being used in the plants, are they making it into the water system? This is the same water that will come into our homes, and praying that there is good treatment or effective treatment services to ensure that the water coming into the homes, into the offices, into the healthcare facilities is actually well treated and free of these either antibiotic residues or toxic agents. So while there is also little focus of WASH, or rather WASH in household communities, or even infection prevention and control, there's a lot of focus in the healthcare facilities. So you might find that the water is controlled, yes. However, the same people consuming this infected water, or the same people who are not able to practice hand hygiene and sanitation, are the same people who will come to the healthcare facilities. And because of consuming water that already has resistant genes, will probably not respond to the treatment guidelines that are in place. And this means that there will be prolonged hospital stay. You can go to the next slide, please. Prolonged hospital stay, which translates to hospital-acquired infections. There's increased mortalities amongst maybe the mothers who come to deliver, children under 5. There's also increased healthcare costs, especially when we look at our setting, where most of us are forced to pay out of pocket. This actually then translates to increased poverty, because you will find our farmers having to go sell their cattle off, right? It's the same cattle that maybe they're relying on for selling to send their children to school. That means the ripple effect that maybe then the children will not go to school, not only because that they're sick, but because there's no fee to pay, since the same cattle has been used to offset a hospital bill, for example. This is their source of food, yeah, source of protein. So then malnutrition creeps up. And apart from that, because of taking contaminated water and suffering from diarrheal diseases, then you find malnutrition will just set in just as well, because already you're affecting the gut system, right? And then there's the dangers, of course, of environmental contamination, as I've shown you before, and consumption of food with antimicrobial residues. So as Dr. Mitchell has ably discussed around antimicrobial resistance, next slide, please. Antimicrobial resistance, apologies once again, this was meant to come in after the definition, but as already you've been told, it occurs when previously susceptible microbes adapt and no longer respond to the antimicrobial agents that were effective before. And though it's a naturally occurring phenomena, it is especially catalyzed by overuse of antimicrobials, lack of adherence to water, sanitation and hygiene, and just infection control. And unfortunately also by lack of stringent regulatory systems in place, as we see in most of our regions. So while the AMR has garnered high-level attention, and the United Nations actually as early as 17, sorry, had already shown that this publication showing that it could kill, AMR could kill up to 10 million people annually by 2050. Of more concern to us is the fact that while yes, we are not effectively strengthening our WASH systems, it's been about 3 decades since the big pharmaceutical companies withdrew or started withdrawing from developing and manufacturing new classes of effective antibiotics, meaning that we are now working with agents that have been there and continue to be there, but are not as effective anymore because resistance has crept in. So we are finding ourselves in, between a rock and a hard place, where we need to preserve precious non-renewable sources, that is the antimicrobials, but at the same time, make sure that WASH is effectively managed. However, this is usually not the case, meaning we're still getting the infections, preventable infections, because we are not effectively tying up WASH with antibiotic use or antimicrobial use, and hence AMR continues to linger behind there as the silent pandemic, yet it is in our face with the antimicrobials that will be used because someone has diarrhea, someone is just not feeling well, and they'll rush to the pharmacy or to the street side vendor and just get an antibiotic. Next slide, please. So the next slide just shows, yes, our non-renewable source, and this is one of REACT's infographic, which really does show how our precious antibiotics or antimicrobials are used right through the spectrum, not only in basic healthcare service, but even in modern medicine, such as hip replacement and cancer treatment. Next slide, please. So the next slide, if you can first look on your far right, this map shows that by 2050, as we've already been told, we will have unimaginable numbers of resistant infections affecting the globe. However, it is Asia and Africa that will be suffering from majority of these resistant infections and the mortalities that ensue. Meaning that the economic burden that is being projected from both antimicrobial resistance and not investing properly in WASH is most likely to disproportionately affect both our continents. So as you've already been told, without containing AMR, then SDGs will not be met. But then again, we've been told that perhaps we need to rethink rather than see how to address the SDGs. Then maybe it's time to look at it from the other side and take on AMR to show how we can address complex situations, and hence SDGs. The number of people living in extreme poverty will increase up to 24 million by 2030. Our GDPs will decrease by possibly up to 11% by 2050. Livestock production will not only have low productivity, but might decline by about 11% by 2050. This looks like a small number when you look at it, but let's not forget the scenario I just put, where majority of our population actually rely on their livestock. They rely on their farm produce to make ends meet, to run their households. So while 11% may seem as a really small figure, it is quite a large figure when you think about the repercussions. So while there'll be low productivity, yet our urban areas are continuing to grow, right? So there's increased demand for sources of protein, but this will be at increased prices, yet we're not able to meet the prices or the cost of living, because then we have to use majority of our out-of-pocket funding towards taking care of our health. Ladies and gentlemen, measly investment of $1 on AMR containment today will ensure a return rate of about 31% back to our economies. The same $1, if we invest it in sprucing our wash services, it will yield a return of $5 per each $1 put to invest in wash. Meaning if today our governments each were to just invest, let's say 1 million in local currency, wherever you may be, just translate that on how much comes back to make sure that we strengthen our health systems. We strengthen the education, the quality of education being given to our children, and even just ensure that there's equity all around, not only for the vulnerable, but also gender equality, and even just building our economies. Next slide, please. So having said all that, then what is the most sensible solution? I think the previous speaker already spoke to this, but there's been a call to actually address both AMR and WASH by incorporating one aspect into the other and the other one into the other, vice versa. So addressing, we already have the AMR Global Action Plan, and we have national action plans in place. How about when we are revising them? Because now majority of the national action plans are actually coming to an end and need to be revised. How about then including and incorporating WASH as an aspect that has to be monitored and evaluated as the other indicators for AMR are being monitored, and vice versa, that AMR indicators are actually incorporated into any framework that guides WASH. Currently, unfortunately, WASH is categorized as an AMR sensitive field, and this is what also complicates or presents an obstacle to allowing effective alignment of the two. Yeah, as you've seen before, the two affect each other. And as long as we have fragmented WASH facilities in place, then we will continue to use antimicrobials. And most of our cases, it's inappropriately because we don't have strengthened regulatory systems in place, and hence AMR. So when you look in front of you, the proposed action areas, for example, action area 2 will ensure that WASH is also addressed not only at healthcare facility levels, as shown in action area 3, and what is usually the norm actually, but also now at household and community levels. Action area 4 will incorporate the whole One Health aspect when it comes to addressing WASH, so that we're not sharing the same water sources with our animals. We're not conducting recreational activities where we are still taking the water to go use back at home. And even the factories and other, whether big or small, are actually put to task in ensuring that the wastewater, including hospitals actually, that the wastewater going in is treated and does not contaminate our water. And then, of course, I've mentioned the manufacturing of antimicrobials to ensure that there's reduction in the biocide footprint that is especially seen in the high-income countries, and India being the pharmaceutical, or rather the factory of the low and middle income countries when it comes to antimicrobials, right? This has to be supported by continuous surveillance and research, monitoring and evaluation. And apart from that, there has to be already will and political will and buy-in and coordination, governance and leadership that ensures that all these action areas are put into place, are running effectively and are running efficiently. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll open up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy, for the fabulous presentation. The floor is now open for questions. Can also put your questions in the chat box. I think there's a question from Anjali in the chat. Can you please explain whether the use of sanitizer can reduce antibiotic resistance to some extent? I think that the question is aimed at you, Tracy.
Okay. I saw, okay, or maybe he's left. I had seen Dr. Phillips, so I wanted him to answer that question. So can use of sanitizer reduce antibiotic resistance to some extent? My answer is I'm not very sure. However, papers are actually showing and research is showing that as we continue to rapidly use sanitizers, what we're doing is also killing our microbiome that helps us, you know, our good flora, let me put it that way. And also a lot of these agents are going into the waterway. So there is research that is showing that many of these chemicals that we are using, unfortunately, are presenting a good stressor that further creates a selection pressure for resistance of antimicrobials. I do not have proof, and if there's someone who's more conversant with this subject, I would ask that they also give the response. But I think the long and short answer is no. It should not be able to reduce antibiotic resistance because, as the previous speaker showed, how antibiotic resistance happens is a different process, right? And really has nothing to do with the use of sanitizers or not, right? It's a selection pressure. The more you use antibiotics, the more then you cause antibiotic resistance to happen or antimicrobial resistance to happen. And so sanitizers really have no place there. I think so. Oh, yeah, Jessica?
I was just going to jump in there and say, like, I find this question really interesting. I don't know about you, Tracy. I get asked it quite a lot. And it's so hard to answer because there isn't a great amount of data there. But like Tracy was saying, it makes sense that if we're doing something that stresses microbes, resistance is likely to evolve. And that real pressing concern that sanitizer doesn't stay on our hands, we touch other things and we wash it off. And I know for a lot of our community-based projects, the objectives that we give people, or the advice we give people, is to wash your hands with soap and water if the soap is available, because what soap does is makes your hands slippy, so the microbes just slip off. They're not actually being damaged, they're not being killed, they're not being stressed in any way, they're just being removed from your hands. So then when you touch something else or someone else, you're not transferring them, and so you're minimizing infection. So in the absence of data and publications on the topic, that's the objectives and the behaviours that we try to encourage at community level.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, I've always been a proposer of washing hands rather than using sanitizer, but yeah, it's not always possible, unfortunately. Yeah, thank you.
We have another question from Sachin Swami. Question is, how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our infection control and hygiene practices? Second part is, even if we think the pandemic has sensitized hygiene practices, what care should be taken to make it sustainable?
Oh, wow. Okay, I think that just, you know, taking from where we've just responded to, Jessica and myself, how has the pandemic affected our infection control and hygiene practices? When we go on ground, it's definitely boosted infection control and hygiene practices, not only in healthcare facilities, but even at household level, at community level. Now, when you enter malls or you enter, any establishment, you're told to sanitize, right? So hence the question that was being answered. So in terms of that, it has improved. However, that's just the hygiene part, the hand hygiene part. Are our governments really doing anything in terms of making sure that the wastewater that is going into the environment is now being controlled, is being treated before it gets into the water, right? We've seen with COVID, there's an increase of antibiotic use, especially azithromycin and the rest. These same antibiotics, the residues are the ones that will go into our waterways, depending on what sanitation facility you are exposed to. So right there already, we are seeing a problem in terms of, yes, the infection control in terms of hand hygiene has been taken up a few notches, but infection control in terms of quote unquote ingesting the perhaps resistant genes that are coming from the waterways, which then finds our way onto our plate finally. Is it really being addressed? I don't know. If I speak for Kenya, where I'm placed, to be honest, I have not heard our environmental ministries saying that they're doing anything to beef up that. No. And even if, as you've asked, we think the pandemic has sensitized hygiene practices, what care should be taken to make it sustainable? I think sustainability is two-pronged. We need to advocate from ground up. Now that we have seen that we are actually capable, or our governments are capable of ensuring that these infection control practices are put in place, the same way then we expect that from the policy level, they are either updating the policies, and not only are they being updated, but they're being implemented. Many of our regions are those that will have policies in place, beautifully written, but they stay on the shelves. They're not really doing what they should be doing. So in terms of sustainability, it is up to you and I think, at the community level, start at the community level, household level. For example, at REACT, we also engage children at elementary school level to be change agents when it comes to hand washing and use of toilets. And this they go preach back at home, and they just try and show their parents how, proper use of the toilet proper hand washing will actually keep infections at bay, and less use of antibiotics, which will then ensure that we are slowing down antimicrobial resistance. In Africa, because malaria is endemic, even with these children, we are able to show them that, look, for example, when we started treating malaria, when I was a child, for example, we were treating with quinine. But then at some point we were told we have to move on to, the SP ranges. And now we're treating with artemether-lumefantrine. Why? This is how resistance occurs, yeah? Meaning the more you use an antimicrobial agent, the more likely it is that it will no longer be effective. So if then you can prevent infections by washing hands, by ensuring that your pit latrines are well covered, or now also advocating for what we're calling saddle pans to make sure that the plastic is placed on the pit latrine, it's easier to wash and disinfect. And then of course, wash your hands properly, that you'll keep infections at bay. And this can be sustained going on because it's coming from the ground up. And at the same time, we are advocating and lobbying that the policymakers have to ensure that this is implemented. Over.
We have a few more questions coming in the chat. I think in the interest of time, maybe we can take one or two. If that is okay with you, Tracy?
Yeah, that's fine. That's okay.
Yeah, so we have a question from Rohit. Question is, are there regulatory constitutions that help in the surveillance of industrial waste releases in water?
Yes, even at the international level, that's why the bodies such as, not necessarily regulatory, but the UNDP is there. These are the ones that are in charge of what is being released into the environment. Now, when it comes to country level and even regional level, whether it's Europe, whether it's Africa, Asia, there are still also regulatory constitutions that will mandate the national bodies to ensure that the waste being released into the water meets the international accepted levels. However, all states are at liberty to, one, state that in fact, let's look at, for example, the United States of America. They have the different states that are run through a federal government type of governance. And the different states, and even in Kenya, we have the same, the different states will be governed differently. So you might find that if we come to India, Kerala state will say that no, 2 micro, what are they called? Parts per particle will be accepted in water. But then Kolkata will say we can allow up to 3, right? But yes, the short answer is there are regulatory constitutions. I will try and send some to Vishal, some links that are supposed to put that in place. Surveillance is completely usually up to the nation, and then they're supposed to channel the feedback back to the international bodies. Over. Unless Jessica has something to add to that. Jessica?
Yeah, it's sort of the same thing to say. And the other challenge with having regulatory constitutions is a lot of the research around figuring out, how much of a certain compound is safe in the environment can often be funded by pharmaceutical companies themselves. So there can be inherent bias in the figures that are released saying, oh, whatever part per million is safe. If you look back through the chain, it could be a pharmaceutical company that funded that research. So there's questions there. I know a lot of pharmaceutical companies are opening their doors now in a way, and showing how much effluent they release and releasing that publicly so people can start to develop more trust. But I think there is work to be done to identify what is safe, and equally what happens when these compounds mix together in the environment, because one factory might be releasing an antimicrobial and the next factory up the road could be releasing a completely different substance, and they've each met their targets and they're doing the right thing. But what happens when those two chemicals mix in the environment, and how does that challenge microbes? And I think they're questions that aren't yet fully answered by all these frameworks.
Thank you. Yeah, that's quite important, actually, even as we do our advocacy, just to recognize that if it's pharmaceutically funded, it might be, it might be compromised. Not all the time, though, but we need to be cognizant of that. Thanks, Jessica.
I think there is one last question. I think it's directed at Dr. Michelle. The question is, how does use of sanitizers and sodium hypochlorite affect environmental bacterial patterns, as they would become resistant to these cleaning agents used vigorously during the pandemic? The question is by Saurabh Pandey.
Yeah, great question. Again, I think the answer is similar to the question about sanitizer and resistance. We know that a lot of these chemicals, so not just sanitizers, but different cleaning, so like an outdoor cleaning chemical like the one mentioned here, have been used massively more and in higher concentrations during the pandemic. And we're not yet getting all the data in to understand what the repercussions of that is. It would be sensible to assume that the increased use of those chemicals is going to increase resistance, because the two reasons: you're putting a load of chemicals into the environment that kill things. So we're going to kill microbes regardless of their function. So Tracy mentioned this with hand sanitizer. You can kill the good bacteria and the good microbes on your hands, and it's the same in the environment. There's microbes that are very beneficial for digesting waste, for helping you digest your food in your body. And having those microbes there can outcompete some of the more negative infections and almost keep them in check. So putting a load of chemicals in the environment can suddenly mean that the bad bacteria, or bad microbes, if you like, are allowed to increase in numbers. But in terms of resistance, it's also sensible to assume that the more chemicals we put in the environment, the more stressful an environment we create for microbes, the more likely it is that they're going to change some of their genetic material, and that some of those changes are going to lead to resistance. And it's the same with, I mean, any type of pollution. So even heavy metal pollution, we know that that challenges microbes to make similar changes. So changes to similar parts of their genetic makeup and their DNA that antimicrobial pollution does. So I guess the bottom line is that anything going into our environment, and particularly through our wastewater systems, could potentially be a problem. Exactly how it's a problem and the finer details of that are specific to each chemical and each pollutant, but yeah, it's probably going to be a problem.
Thank you, Dr. Jessica, for answering the query. I think in the interest of time, I think we'll have to maybe hopefully take any more questions at a later period of time. You can directly contact us if you have any further queries. So with that, we are coming to the end of our webinar today. I would like to take the opportunity to sincerely thank both Dr. Jessica Michelle and Tracy for being with us today and engaging the students on very informative and educative sessions. Once again, thank you, Dr. Jessica. And also, thank you, Dr. Tracy, for being with us today. Also, I take the opportunity to thank all the ASPIC members, both faculty advisors and also the student members, for being here. I think we had some conflicting schedules with some of the institutions, and all of them were not able to be here today. But again, thank you for all the members for being here. So once again, thank you to everyone for being with us here today. Hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.